So we are going to be building a K24 for our Civic Type R. Let's run through every single thing that you're gonna need, all the parts. You're gonna need, of course, a basic set of hand tools. There may be a few specialty tools here and there that you're gonna need, but let's run through all the parts real quick. Starting out, of course, you are gonna need your engine block. This guy has a nice fresh bore on it. Got it all cleaned up, looking pretty. Going to need a crank. We are using a OEM crank today that we just had repolished. This is what I call a girdle or the main cap. Timing cover. We are running a K20Z3 oil pan, K-tuned valve cover. Here's the oiling stuff and timing stuff. K20 oil pump with the K20 baffle, timing chain, timing guides, and the tensioner is under there somewhere. There's our main bolts, crank gear, some other stuff. Now for aftermarket parts that we are running, we are going to be utilizing the BC I-beam connecting rods. Part number is BC6047. These are K24 specific. A lot of the stuff is K20 or K24, kind of universal. These are considered the MOR rods, M-O-A-R, aka the mother of all rods. These guys are a little bit overkill for what we need in our power goals. Just a nice standard steel I-beam connecting rod. These things are rated for way more power than we're shooting for. On this car, we're shooting for about 700 max. CP pistons, we have the Speed Factory L19 Extreme Duty Head Stud Kit, King bearings, new seals, new gaskets, skunk to crank trigger because the stock one is a little bit brittle. And then down here is all the head stuff. Cylinder head, all of the valve train stuff is in there. BC head gasket, BC stage 2 cams, part number is 0042-2. And then with these cams, you do need to run their spring and retainer kit. So this is the 0040 kit, titanium retainer, and dual spring combo kit. And if you don't know the car it's going in, this is our 2021 Honda Civic Type R. Of course, this car does come factory with the K20 C1, and it is front wheel drive. The car is now all wheel drive, and we are putting the K24 in it. This guide is going to show you everything that you need to do as far as assembly goes. I will include all the torque specs for every little thing and all the parts that we are installing, all the aftermarket goodies. I will go ahead and link down in the description box below. I should also mention a lot of this stuff is going to be universal to all of the K series engines, K20, K24, but some of the like torque specs and whatnot, you may need to confirm if you are not assembling a K24A2. So the first thing I always like to do when building a new engine is, of course, I go through and clean everything. All that said and done, right up after that, I go through and measure every single thing. So the things that you need to measure, unless you just trust your machine shop to do it all, which that's completely fine as well, but I would like to double check. We need to measure the main bearing clearance, the rod bearing clearance, piston wall clearance, and we're also going to be setting the ring end gap. I always say this is the boring part. It's a little bit tedious. You're going to need some specialty tools for this for sure, which I'll show you here in a minute. Or you can also use plastic gauge for your rod and main bearing clearances. You cannot use that, of course, for piston and wall clearance, but the tools I'm going to show you here in a minute are definitely a little bit more accurate, I would say, than plastic gauge. So I just drew up this little spec sheet. We got our mains, rods, piston to wall, and ring end gap with all of the goals of each. First thing we're gonna do is measure out the crank, the mains, and the rods, and write all of that down on this sheet here. And the tools that we're using to measure the crank out, I don't like reading traditional mics, so we have a set of digital mics. I like to zero these things out, and they give you this little guy, exactly 2 inches long. So what you do is set the guy in there, hold down both buttons at once, bam. There we go. All right, zeroed out. Measurement on journal 1 is 2.16465. And the first rod is 1.888. So the whole entire crank is measured out. Here's the main line and the rod. Now we need to go ahead and get the main cap on to the block with the bearings installed, get it properly torqued down, and then we need to go through and measure the main line on the block. And then we're gonna do the same thing with our connecting rods. As you can see, we have 2 sets of the rod bearings and 2 sets of main bearings. One set is a standard size, and then one set is what they call an extra oil clearance size. As you can see here, the part number on the extra oil clearance size is STDX, and on this one it's just STD. We are going to assemble using the standard bearings and check clearances with the standard size bearings. And if needed, we do have the extra oil clearance bearings if needed. We probably won't use them, but we might. The main bolts go to an initial torque of 22 foot-pounds and then an additional 56 degrees. Now to measure the block, we will need a set of the snap T-gauges. Let me show you how it's done. Easiest way to get the T-gauge in the block, compress it like this, tighten the end, insert like so at an angle, and then you tighten this guy just a little bit at the end and drag it straight. All right, now we take this and we insert into the digital mics. So the measurement came out to 2.16685. We're gonna subtract it from the 2.16465 and we get a bearing clearance of 0.0022. So we have a final main bearing clearance of 1 at 0022, 2 is at 0020, 3 should be a little bit bigger, it's at 00235, 4 is at 0021, and 5 is at 0021. So those are all well within spec. We're gonna run those, good to go. Now we need to do the same exact concept with the rods. So we already have the crank measured out for the rod journals. Now we need to go ahead, take out the very beautiful I-beams from BC, split them, insert the bearings, measure them out. We're going for a little bit bigger of a clearance on the rods versus the mains. Let's see what we got. Alrighty, all of the rods, every single one is at 0025, which is beautiful. Torque spec on the ARP 625 pluses on the I-beams is 55 foot-pounds, whereas the OEM rod bolts would be a 14 foot-pound and then an additional 90 degrees. All right, we're all done with the bearing clearances on this motor. From here, we're gonna go ahead and check the piston to wall clearance. To measure the piston to wall clearance, what you're going to need is a bore gauge. I have the Fowler bore gauge and your micrometers. So the first thing we're gonna do is measure the piston. And where you measure the piston is 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the skirt with your mics. All right, so this here is the size of the piston skirt, 3.4208. Now we need to set our bore gauge to this size here. Grab your bore gauge and grab whatever extension that you need to make up. So on here we have a 3.2 inch and then a 0.04 shim. And now we need to zero out the bore gauge. So we're gonna put the bore gauge into the mic. So you see this needle right here? You can rotate this ring around to where the needle lines up with the zero. And that is called zeroing out your bore gauge. All right, so you guys see that needle right on the zero? Bore gauge is zeroed out. Now we're gonna go ahead and measure the bore. So you'll see it spin around a few times. This zero right here is the exact size of our piston skirt. So anything under that is gonna be the piston to wall clearance. So that'd be 001, 002, 003, 04. We're at 0035. Now I would recommend measuring your bore in a couple different locations, on the top, on the bottom, and then like so. Flip it 90, measure there just to make sure it's not egg shaped. So cylinder 1 is perfect, 0035. 2 is 0035. 3 is 00355. And 4 is 00349. 0035. I know that was a quick explanation. Using a bore gauge is very, very simple. To reiterate and go through it again, measure the piston with your mics, zero out your bore gauge, and then anything under the zero is your piston to wall clearance. They're all at 0035. Of course, that's what they should be according to the piston spec sheet right here. Piston to cylinder clearance, 0.0035. So that is it for the measurements that we need to take. The last thing that we need to do is set the ring end gap before we assemble. I've spent a few hours measuring, and just to go over it once again, here's the tools that I used: snap P gauges, digital mics, and the bore gauge. That's the extent of the specialty tools that you'll need when building a motor. I'll link these 3 down below. Moving on to setting the ring end gap. So there's a few different rings here. We have ring number 1. This is the top compression ring, the shiny guy. The letter always goes up, or if there's a dot, that'll go up. Ring number 2, the second compression ring, letter goes up. And then we have the oil control rings. There's a total of 3 rings here, 2 super thin ones, and then this little squiggly guy right here. We're gonna be setting the end gap on the compression rings. I do like to check the end gap of the oil scraper rings. I have ran into it before where there is no gap at all, so I would highly recommend double checking that. Now, how to measure the ring end gap: we're gonna take the ring itself, pinch it together, insert it down into the bore, turn it sideways like so, and then grab one of your very beautiful CP pistons and push the ring down into the bore, about that deep. Now, grab a set of feeler gauges. If you don't know what these are, this is what they are. This is what they look like. The top compression ring, we're gonna set to a 0.019 inch. So we just take this guy and try and insert it into that gap. It don't fit, which is better than it fitting and being loose. All right, so that gap's about a 12 right now. So we need to pull that ring out and file it, open up the gap to a 0.019 or whatever spec that you're going for. Depends on if you're going all motor or you're going boost, how much boost, all that good stuff. Typical rule of thumb for me is I'd rather have it looser than tight, especially with boost. When these things heat up, they expand. And if they expand too much, that will hit and you'll have bigger problems like cracked pistons, destroyed bores, all that good stuff. I have this cheap little ring end gap filing tool. These are only about $20, $30, which I'll go ahead and link down below as well. I go a little bit at a time because if you go too much, then you're gonna have to order a set of new rings, which no one wants to do. All right, 2 files later, that was pretty good. We have our 0.019 feeler gauge out. And you can see it's a snug fit and she slides right in, bam. One thing to keep in mind, you need to make sure you're filing your ring and keeping it square, meaning you don't want this bottom edge wider than the top edge or vice versa. You want the gap even throughout the whole ring. 1 ring down, 7 more to go. All of the ring end gaps are set. The first compression ring went to 019. The second compression ring, we're all already at 023, so we didn't have to do anything there. And that, my friends, leads us to assembly time. Before we assemble though, there's one thing I wanted to take care of, and that is a glorious broken off oil pan bolt. All right, we got a bolt welded on to the broken bolt, and let's see if she'll come out. Please come out. Rip. Try again. 9 times out of 10, welding a bolt on does the trick, but this time it did not, so it looks like we are forced to drill it out. Unfortunately, it was one of those bolts that just would not come out no matter what. I ended up getting it out, but I did ruin the hole, so I did have to helicoil it. We're all good now. Let's go ahead and get this engine assembled. Everything is pre-cleaned, but before the official assembly, I do like to go through with brake cleaner and compressed air, re-clean it all again, just to make sure there's no dirt or grit or any sort of grime on the block or the crankshaft. Everything is cleaned up. Let's go ahead and get the block side bearings installed. The bearings that go in the block match that groove. That's how the oil gets through. And the nice thing about the King bearings, they come with this little case that are all numbered, so you can put them back in the same hole. All of the mains are installed. Now we're gonna go ahead and install the thrust washers. Grooves face out, flat side goes in. And if they want to fall out, which they usually do, let me show you what to do. You can put a touch of your assembly lube on the back side and that'll kind of hold it in place. Each of these bearings are also going to get a touch of assembly lube. This is just for on the first start, you make sure it's not running dry and destroying all your bearings. Make sure you coat the thrust washers as well. Everything is lubed up, crank is ready to be installed for the very last time. All right, same concept with the main girdle. Re-clean it, get the bearings installed, get them lubed up. And this guy is gonna go on the block, but we do need to apply sealant to that first. So being that this mates right to the block, there's no gasket that goes there, we do need to go ahead, get it cleaned up with some brake cleaner is what I use. You can also use acetone or lacquer thinner. I like brake cleaner. Get both mating surfaces cleaned up, and then we're gonna be applying some of this liquid bond is what I use. Part number is 1217H. You can also just go to your local part store and pick up some of this ultra gray from Permatex. Once again, 22 foot-pounds in the specific sequence, and then 56 additional degrees. Everything is torqued down. All of the outer, the M8 by 1.25 bolts with the 12mm head, those guys go to 16 foot-pounds. Up next, we need to hang the pistons on the rods and get the rods and piston assembly inserted into the block and bolted onto the crank. So, first thing we're gonna do is get the piston on the rod, and then from there we're gonna do rings on piston, and then it's gonna go in the block. So laid out here, we have the rods, the pistons, all of the wrist pins, and here are the circlips. So the very first thing I'm gonna do is put one circlip into each of the pistons. It's pretty easy to do. Take 1/2, slide her in like so, and then just work your way around it with a little flathead until she's fully seated. Make sure your circlip is fully seated like so. If it's not, it'll pop out and you'll blow and destroy your motor. And now we are going to get the piston installed onto the rod, and we are going to use a little bit of assembly lube on the wrist pin as well. Lube up the small end of the rod, the little brass bushing in here. She's going to get some lube as well. Now that all the pistons are on the rods, we got to put the circlips on this side of the piston so the wrist pin don't back out. Now for the rings going on the pistons. I explained earlier where the placement of each ring is. Silver is top, the thick dark gray is the middle, and then these two sets over here are the oil rings. This is the placement I always use. You guys can see the piston pin center line there, and then the placement of each ring. I like to hang the rod and the piston assembly in the vise as I put the rings on. Makes it go a little bit easier. These guys are ready to go into the block. I should have mentioned this earlier, but the rod and the rod cap are machined together. So you cannot take, say, this cap here and put it on that rod or vice versa. That is why I have all of them labeled number 1 on the rod, number 1 on the cap, 22, 33, 44. Very crucial, you do not mess that up. Second thing with your rod is the bearing tangs. So the bearing tang is that little guy right there. That goes into the cap. This bearing tang on the cap needs to be on the same side as the bearing tang on the rod. For inserting the piston and rod into the block, I would highly recommend planning ahead and ordering one of these. This is a billet ring compressor, and it is bore specific, as you guys can see. This one is 86.5. These are 87 mil pistons, so we're gonna have to resort to this janky thing. It works, but it does take quite a bit longer to ensure you do not snag any rings on the deck when you're going in. Buy one of these, not one of these. This next part is kind of like personal preference. Some people use WD-40, some people use regular engine oil. I've always used, as of recent, just ATF to lube the cylinder walls and the piston and ring. First piston is in the hole. As you can see, there are no markings on these pistons. And if your pistons do not have markings, just know the intake valve reliefs, which are the little cutouts on top of the piston. The bigger ones are the intake. So on a K series, it's gonna go toward the front of the car. That guy is definitely no fun to use, but all of the pistons are in the holes. Let's flip this guy over and get the rod cap and rod bolts on and torqued. So 1 and 4 are currently at the bottom of the stroke. Let's grab number 1. And another thing to note with pretty much all, I think it's all ARP hardware, is you need to lube the threads and underneath the head of the bolt with the ARP fastener lube. Cap has the assembly lube on her. Hole 1, bearing tang to bearing tang. there's that. I'm gonna go ahead, get these torqued down, and then rotate the engine 180 and get 2 and 3 on. So they say put both of the bolts at 10 foot-pounds. There's 10 there, 10 there. Now we're gonna do one sweeping motion without stopping all the way 255 foot-pounds. Just like that. Alrighty, everything is torqued. Engine rotates over freely. Last thing to do to have a complete short block is install the oil squirters. They go in that hole right in the center there. And that is what they look like. I know on 4B11s, which is an Evo 10 engine, a lot of times with aftermarket pistons, you do have to bend them a little bit or just delete them. I'm hoping we do not have to bend on this one. So now that we have a complete short block, we are going to move on to assembling the cylinder head. So we have the head itself here with all of the valves. The machine shop just went through this thing, made sure it's all good to go, resurfaced it. Over here we have the factory cams, all the rollers, cam caps, Speed Factory stem seals for intake and exhaust, and then the BC cams and springs and retainers. First thing we need to do is get the valve train reassembled. But just like anything else, the first thing that we're gonna do is go through, clean her up with brake cleaner, and blow her off with compressed air. Head is cleaned, valves are cleaned, stems were lubed, and the valves are now back in the head. So from here, we're gonna need our spring seats. You need 16 seats total, and then you need 32 of the valve keepers. So the seat is gonna go on first, like so, and then it goes stem seal. Keep in mind, these are intake exhaust specific. They are labeled if you're gonna go with these Speed Factory ones. So it goes valve in, spring seat, stem seal, spring, retainer, and then the keeper. Now it is time to install the springs and retainers and the keepers. You can see we already got all of the exhaust ones in. I don't have the most special spring compressor tool in the world. I have that guy. I rented this little thing from an auto parts store. No good. This works much better. The C-clamp style is the best, but this guy does work. Let me show you how to use it. So the first thing is you want to make sure the valve does not push down when you're compressing the spring. So I just grabbed this little towel, put it on the head of the valve, nice and solid. Now we're gonna grab our spring combo. These are dual springs and there is a certain way they go. So the tighter coil goes on the bottom, the more open coil goes on top. So she goes like so. Grab one of your titanium retainers. And before I set this on the spring, I grab the keepers and set them in there. Should look like that. Now, grab your little assembly here, set it on the spring. This nub presses down on the keepers, and then you just press down on the whole tool. Just like that, she done. It's pretty easy to tell if the keepers are locked in or not. They should be even, with maybe a couple of millimeters of the valve stem sticking out. Let's go ahead and knock out the intakes. Let's get the rest of the head complete. So here are the bases. We're gonna put 2 through 5 on the head first, and then all of the tappets and rollers and the rods have to go on. The very first thing we do install are these guys here, and these drop right down in that hole. Everything is laid out how it came out of the head. That's what I would recommend doing, just to be sure everything goes back in the right place. Alrighty boys, it is now time for the camshafts. We can put the gears and whatnot on later. So these are once again the BC 0042-2. This guy here is the intake. I do like to use assembly lube on the journals, the cam journals. So this guy is fully assembled, ready to be bolted on. Head is complete. This goes on the motor. We need to torque down the hardware, and then this guy goes on the head. Head gasket of choice is the Brian Crower BC 8206. Here are the L19 Speed Factory head studs, and per Speed Factory's recommendations, we're gonna put just a touch of engine oil on the threads that go into the block. They do not get torqued going into the block. They only go in hand tight. Rub that around a little bit. Like I said, do not torque them going into the block. Finger tight only. The threads all get a little bit of this ARP assembly lube, and just a little bit on each side of the washer as well. Cylinder head is on and torqued. The nuts go to 30 and then 60, and then 90 foot-pounds. And now she is ready for the cams. Almost forgot, there is a little bit of sealant that needs to go in between the cap and the cylinder head right here. All of the 8mm bolts go to 16 foot-pounds, and then the 3 smaller 6mm bolts go to 8.7 foot-pounds. The trigger wheels go to 29 foot-pounds. Intake cam gear goes to 83 foot-pounds. Exhaust cam gear goes to 51 foot-pounds. Now let's move on to setting the valve lash. Per the BC spec sheet, valve clearance goes to intake at 006, exhaust at 008. So here we have the 008 feeler gauge, and you put it in between the tappet and the valve stem. A little bit loose, 9 fits in there. So the 10 is a pretty tight fit. So what we need to do is adjust the valve lash. Let me show you how to do that. I have this little valve lash adjuster tool. So you need to loosen the lock nut like that. Grab the 008, set her up in there. Tighten the adjuster. All right, there we have it. She's set at 008. So we need to hold this handle and go ahead and tighten the lock nut. All right. 008's in there. Nice snug fit. We're good to go. Let's knock out all the exhaust to 008, flip to the intake, those go 006, and we're done. The valve lash is adjusted. The jam nut torques to 14 foot-pounds. Now we can move on to the oiling stuff. Here's the K20 pump and the baffle. As soon as you get these on, we can move on to timing. The two 8mm bolts go to 16 foot-pounds, and all these 6mm bolts go to 8.7. Let's get this thing timed. So the first thing we need to do when timing is get everything lined up. The cam gears lined and the crank gear lined. So there's an arrow on the crank gear here and an arrow on the block. So we're gonna spin the crank. Oop, too far. All right, she's lined up there. And then on the cam gears, there's two lines and then there's two dots. The dots go to the dark links on the timing chain, and the lines on each cam gear have to line up like that. All right, now we grab our chain. So there's two dark links here and two here. Those two go to the cams like that. And then the single dark link runs down to the crank gear. All said and done, it should look like this. Here's the exhaust. Here's the intake. You can see the two links are right around the single dot. A little bit hard to see the dot on the crank gear, but it is right in line with this dark link. Timing is all finished up. Let's pop the pin and make sure that she turns over properly. Now, before we go ahead and install the timing cover onto the engine, I've always really liked the look of these things being wrinkle black. So I'm gonna go ahead, give this thing a quick sandblast and powder coat it splatter black from Prismatic Powders. All of the hard work is done with the engine. The last three things that we need to install are the oil pan, the valve cover, and the timing cover. Before I put these parts on, I am going through, and you guessed it, if you've been following along on the build, I've been obsessed with zinc plating all the hardware, and I figured we should probably do it on the engine as well. Quite the process. Degreaser tank, rinse, muriatic acid, rinse, zinc station for 15-20 minutes, rinse, and then if we decide to do yellow zinc, which I am on all this, yellow zinc for 4 or 5 seconds, rinse, let it dry, and this is the end result. Super nice. First cover that goes on is our freshly powder coated timing cover. Can't forget the new crank trigger wheel. This goes on first. And now the timing cover is gonna go on, but before we do that, let's swap out the front main. And just like that, we have a 100% ready to go K24 built to handle. I'm gonna shoot for 700-800 wheel on this car, and it's got all the goodies to do so. If you have any questions, drop a comment down below, and either myself or someone else in the comment section will try and get back to you. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Peace out, my friends, and I'll see you guys when we get this motor back in the car.